Thank you all very much for coming. I am Tom Morgan, and I'm the director of the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice. This is the second in a series of programs all year that are dealing primarily with criminal justice. These lectures are sponsored by the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice here at St. Scholastica and funded in part by the Warner Series of the Manitou Fund, the DeWitt and Carolyn Van Evre Foundation, and the Mary C. Van Evre Foundation Endowed Fund in memory of William Van Evre, a former trustee of the college. Additional support has been received from the Royal D. Alworth Junior Institute at the University of Minnesota Duluth, the UMD Department of World Languages and Cultures, Reader Weekly of Duluth, and from numerous other private donors. Thank you all very much for your continued support, and a special thank you to the Alworth family for making all this possible. Those of you who aren't on the mailing list or want to hear more about this, outside in the foyer, there is an opportunity for you to sign up to get postcards on a regular basis dealing with upcoming programs, and you can also put your email there. You can do both, and as long as I can read your email, you'll continue to get email messages from me dealing with upcoming programs. So look for that if you want to be reminded. Also outside in the foyer, there's at least, I think, 2 groups out there. I know there's one for sure, but I think there's 2. The Peace Not Walls group dealing with the issues in Palestine and Israel, and I think there's a table from the UMD Criminology department. By all means, check that out on your way out. After the lecture today, we are going to meet again Wednesday night, and not here at First Lutheran Church here in Duluth. And you are all invited to come back and chat about what we hear tonight from our speaker, Professor William Kelly. And you should all have flyers about that. The person who will be the facilitator of the conversation is Dale Harris, and all his credentials are there. I think I told him earlier tonight, and I think he would agree, that he's a very judgmental person. He's a judge, and so he's going to give us his reviews of the night, and then facilitate a conversation. After Professor Kelly's presentation, then you're all welcome. I encourage you to come up to the front of the stage, use these microphones, ask him hard-hitting questions, and that will make the evening very, very interesting as well, I'm sure. And those of you who know the policy here, you community people, you're very welcome to ask questions, but please defer to the students. I like to have them go first, and many of the students have read Professor Kelly's book, and so they have an advantage over a lot of the rest of you. So let them ask their penetrating questions first. On the screens in front of me, or next to me, in front of you, we're displaying the text of tonight's lecture through technology called real-time captioning. Although we anticipate a high-quality format, there will inevitably be errors that are inherent to the technology. A special thank you to the Edwin H. Eddy Foundation, whose generous support makes this inclusive service possible tonight. Oh yes, one more thing. Turn off your cell phones or any other devices and give all your attention to the speakers. I think that would be appropriate. Our speaker this evening is a professor of sociology and director of the Center for Criminology and Criminal Justice Research at the University of Texas at Austin. He's taught and conducted research in criminology and criminal justice for more than 25 years and has published extensively on a number of justice matters. He's written or co-written several books on these issues, the latest of which is on sale in the foyer after the lecture. That book is entitled The Future of Crime and Punishment: Smart Policies for Reducing Crime and Saving Money. This is a revised edition of a book that was published 3 years ago. This is the book that all my students have read, so they'll tell you it's a good book. Before that, Professor Kelly published with United States District Judge Robert Pitnam, Confronting Underground Justice, Reinventing Plea Bargaining for Effective Criminal Justice Reform. This book addresses problems and concerns with plea negotiation, pretrial systems, criminal prosecution, and public defense. Dr. Kelly has considerable experience developing, implementing, and evaluating numerous criminal justice programs and policies. Much of his evaluation research is focused on diversion programs such as problem-solving courts and probation interventions, as well as behavioral health programs in the justice system, including substance abuse and mental health service delivery. His consulting work spans local and state and federal governments and has given him the opportunity to collaborate with a large number of justice agencies, including law enforcement organizations, probation departments, prisons and jails, state and federal prosecutors, judges, parole agencies, and a number of criminal justice service providers. Dr. Kelly lives in Austin with his wife Emily, a writer and former healthcare manager. Together they enjoy 2 golden retrievers, Millie and Grace. Grace Kelly, get it? In his spare time, Professor Kelly likes to play one of his 3 acoustic guitars. He works out, he enjoys the great outdoors with Emily, and Millie and Grace often accompany them on their mountain hikes. Professor Kelly also enjoys watching and rooting for Emily, who's a serious marathon runner. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor William R. Kelly.
Thank you all very much, but you might want to hold your applause until after I'm done to see if it's worth it. Do I need to be here tomorrow night? I feel like a little, like maybe you're going to talk about me or something, and he's going to be judgmental. Here's what I'd like to do tonight. I want to spend a bit of time talking about criminal justice policy, where we are today, how we got here, what kind of factors came into play, sort of paint a picture of how in this country we've gone about the business of trying to accomplish public safety and the extent to which we've actually done that. I want to talk a bit about what we've accomplished, what it's cost, what the implications are. And I suspect many of you have some sense that the American criminal justice system doesn't work as well as perhaps we would like it to. And that's, I think you'll see fairly shortly, that's a fair conclusion. The obvious question is, where do we go from here? I mean, it's easy to criticize, it's easy to tear things apart. It's much more difficult to say, what's the path forward look like? And importantly, what's the basis for that? We find ourselves in the position today of having decades of evaluation research in a variety of different settings, looking at a variety of different populations that indicate what are the ways to effectively and cost efficiently reduce crime, and importantly, reoffending. So part of it is, where are we today? How did we get here? What factors came into play? But importantly, what happens next? And this is it. This is what people think of when they think of American criminal justice. These are the number of people beginning in 1936 up to 2017 that are incarcerated in jail or prison at the state level and the federal level in the US. For most of this, well, for half of this time series, the prison population was essentially stable. A little bit of bouncing around from time to time, but nothing major was going on that was going to alter the number of people that we incarcerated. And then something dramatic happened. And that something dramatic is obviously unprecedented in our history of prison and jail. And it's really unprecedented in the history of any other country that we know much about. So part of what I want to focus on is what is that about? And hopefully give you a sense of how profound of a policy shift this reflects. Let me also be clear that we're talking about 50 states, each with their own set of, many of them overlapping laws and policies. a separate federal system. And really, at the end of the day, 3,100 and however many counties in the country that are effectively self-contained criminal justice systems. So when we talk about the criminal justice system as a fallacy, there really is no criminal justice system. But what we're looking at here, what you're looking at there, is the combination of 50 states, the federal system, and really what happens day to day in America's courtrooms and prosecutors' offices, jails, and prisons. We have the distinction of having the largest prison population in the country. One obvious reason for that is we are a large country, so we can look at this a bit differently and say, well, let's adjust that number for population. And what that gives us is something called an incarceration rate, which allows us to compare across states, across countries, over time, without population being a variable or a factor. Let's take a little detour, we'll come back in a second. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Just take a look at that list for a minute, and you'll see some countries that you probably would consider rather repressive or punitive. But for some reason, for a variety of reasons, we have a fondness for incarceration that far outpaces really anyone else in the world. Criminal justice is not just about incarceration. In fact, the number of people in prison and jail today pales in comparison to the number of people under what is called community supervision, probation, and parole. I'll spend just a second talking about those because these are terms you have heard before but may not be entirely clear on what they mean. Probation is a form of diversion from incarceration. A probated sentence is one where the judge could have imposed a sentence of incarceration, but instead of that, they divert the individual to community supervision. Conditions are imposed. The individual will be supervised and expected to comply with those conditions. Parole release is also community supervision with conditions. The only difference is that's for people who have been incarcerated and they're let out early under supervision. There's also a version of that at the federal level that is not really parole release, it's just called supervised release. So if we look at the big picture of corrections, which is only a portion of the criminal justice system, we far outpace the rest of the world in terms of how many people we supervise under correctional control. So that's our correction system, but it's really what people think of when they think of American criminal justice policy. There are many ways to talk about the reach of the criminal justice system, but that one at the top is from survey research that was just recently released about 6 months ago. Read that. When I first saw that, it just blew me away. Essentially, half of every adult, what would that look like? A very small person. Half of all adults in this country have an immediate family member who either has been incarcerated or is incarcerated in prison or jail. And other ways to describe it, we have 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's incarcerated population. But that one is really one that sends a pretty clear message to me of I'm not saying right or wrong, but the reach of the criminal justice system and how many people get involved. We also know that it's a disproportionate minority. The majority of people in the criminal justice system at the various stages of processing are individuals of color. How did we do this? Again, it was a remarkable change in policy that everybody participated in at one level or another. It required a massive expansion of, among other things, prison capacity. We're talking about really extensive building programs, bricks and mortar, capital investment in creating prison cells. In 1990, Texas had 50,000 prison inmates. By 1996, they had 150,000 prison inmates. Now, Texas is an exception in many ways, and one of them is how quickly and how aggressively we expanded our prison system. No one else did it quite that way. Rhode Island participated in this. Nebraska, you name the state, they all did it, presumably driven by their own resources and needs. So obviously, expand correctional capacity, whether it's prison, jail, probation departments, whatever. We also had to fundamentally change how we punish people, and that gets to the heart of laws governing the sentencing process. In 1975, everybody in this country was sentenced under what is called indeterminate sentencing, where judges had wide latitude, discretion, within a minimum and a maximum level of punishment. And it was up to the judge to figure out what's most appropriate for this particular individual, considering the crime they committed, how much crime they've committed in the past, other characteristics of the offender, the victim, things like that. So we shifted from that to what we have today, which is really a hybrid, a mix of mandatory sentences, determinate sentences. Judge Harris was telling me at dinner that y'all have guidelines here in Minnesota. That's a version of determinate sentencing. The thought was, there were really two sets of considerations that drove that. One is when judges have so much discretion, they tend to be biased. And that is the whole issue of what is called sentencing disparity. Similar offenders committing similar crimes, getting different punishment. There was also a concern when judges had so much latitude, they tended to be too lenient. I've not really seen any data to support that argument, but it was certainly front and center in driving what is called sentencing reform. Every state changed its sentencing laws to make punishment more certain and in many circumstances more severe. Plea negotiation is a way of expediting the processing of criminal defendants. It bypasses a criminal trial. It essentially involves an agreement between the prosecutor and the defendant, that is the government and the defendant, where the defendant will plead guilty to something, and that will then in turn have a major impact on the sentence. This is an important consideration in the bigger picture of how we got to where we are, because it fundamentally speeded up expedited processing. We've seen a major expansion of criminal law over the past 50 years. Today, no one is really sure how many federal crimes there are. They estimate about 4,500. They also estimate there are about 400,000 federal regulations that have criminal liability attached to them. We have increasingly relied on the criminal justice system as a solution for a variety of behaviors or problems that we don't like, things that we find troubling, distasteful, whatever. And rather than, for example, addressing it with some other type of solution, we'll talk about some of those in a few minutes, we have, the term is criminalized a number of activities and behaviors, and relied on a system that often is ill-equipped and ill-prepared to deal with those things. And then there's the war on drugs. Anyone care to vote on how well that's been working? Any thoughts, any ideas? Well, it's an example of what is called overcriminalization, that is the expansion of the criminal code. If nothing else, it has provided a large number of individuals to occupy both federal and state prison. Today, about 65% of federal prison inmates are drug offenders. About 20 to 25% at the state level are drug offenders. How did this all happen? Well, the irony is Richard Nixon. We had, back when Richard Nixon ran for president in 1967 and was elected in 1968, we had a crime problem. We had the highest crime rates we had had in our history, both violent crime and property crime. We also had race riots that were sweeping the country. Some of you will have remembered this. We had Vietnam War protests on college campuses. There was clear, palpable lack of law and order. In comes Richard Nixon and the Republican Party saying, we got a law and order problem, and I'm the solution. And that was the birth. And if that's for me, I'm not here. But the order is outside on the sidewalk. I have no idea what that means. Richard Nixon said crime and disorder is the problem, and punishment is the solution. And it sold. It resonated. People understand punishment. It's simple. It's intuitive. And it became, in that moment, in the election of Richard Nixon, a political asset. That was the birth of tough on crime. As we know, Richard Nixon had a rough exit from his presidency. He left in 1974, pending impeachment. That sounds vaguely familiar at the moment. Then we had Jimmy Carter, bless his heart, one of the finest human beings, probably not the best presidency in American political history. Ronald Reagan really carried the torch. Elected in 1980, Richard Nixon, hello. Ronald Reagan was responsible for, among other things, the federal sentencing guidelines, which are arguably the toughest sanctioning guidelines in the country. Reagan also poured billions of dollars into state revenue coffers for expanding prisons at the state level. So there was a fair amount of federal assistance in facilitating the expansion of prison capacity. Who remembers the name Willie Horton? Is that familiar to anybody? Bush 41, George H.W. Bush, was, as you all probably remember, Ronald Reagan's vice president. He ran after Reagan turned out, and he ran a tough-on-crime campaign laced with race. Willie Horton was a black man. Well, let me back up. Bush ran against Michael Dukakis, who'd been governor of Massachusetts. Dukakis was painted as being soft on crime. Bush was painted as being tough on crime. There is the wedge issue, a classic wedge issue. Willie Horton was, under Massachusetts law, given furloughs because he was like within 6 months of his release from prison. On one of those furloughs, he did some really horrible things. I can't remember the details. But the ad was a classic fear of crime and black man advertising. It was highly effective. It was leveraging fear and race. And it, again, signaled that tough on crime was the property of the Republican Party. Until Bill Clinton and Al Gore. The National Democratic Committee decided in 1991 or thereabouts that tough on crime was too valuable and that it was time for the Democratic Party to have some of the leverage associated with that. And they painted Clinton Gore as, quote, the new Democrats who can also confront crime in a tough fashion. In fact, Bill Clinton took time out of his campaign to go back to Arkansas, where he had been governor, to witness an execution, signaling, I can be as tough as anybody else. And Clinton Gore won, obviously, election, and that then became sort of the competition of the two major political parties to out-tough each other. Then we had George Bush. He didn't have much to say about crime when he was campaigning. He had been governor in Texas, and he was pretty quiet about crime policy there as well. But September 11th, 2001 changed all that. I mean, you might be wondering, what the hell does, a terrorist attack on New York City and the Pentagon and Pennsylvania have to do with crime policy? And the answer is fear. Fear drives policy. And in particular, fear drives criminal justice policy. The Super Bowl of 2002, Bush had an ad that basically said, drug dealers fund terrorist activity. The obvious connection there is that, what we think of as traditional activity for the criminal justice system, the war on drugs, is now directly tied to the war on terrorism. I was disappointed in the Obama administration in terms of criminal justice policy. They were pretty quiet. The AG's office came up with some interesting concepts, but they never really got much traction. So there were some lost opportunities there. Trump ran as the law and order candidate, and you're wondering, where the hell does that come from? And your guess is as good as mine. Honestly, though, it's the same idea of fear again. It's immigration policy. How was he talking about immigration? They sent us, they're murderers, they're rapists, they're whatevers, and I assume a few of them are good people. What's he talking about there? Fear, once again. And the Trump administration has done some things that sort of echo tough on crime, requiring U.S. attorneys to charge the most serious offense. The evidence will support. Rescinding the Cole memo that basically was a gentle person's agreement that states that it legalized marijuana. The feds would not mess with that, even though they hadn't changed the law. And the Trump administration basically nullified that. Anyhow, a variety of other things. But main thing that the Trump administration gives us is chaos. So any moment, we don't really know what's going on. What else about this bigger picture? I would suggest that many of the reasons that we have the criminal justice system we have today is because we have failed in a number of other important public institutions. We'll see in a little while some of the characteristics of people in the criminal justice system, but our failure to adequately implement sufficient public health capacity plays a significant role. I think the state of public education clearly plays a role. You probably have heard of the school to prison pipeline. There's reality to that. We have lost about 60% of available public housing in this country over the past 10 years. Homelessness is often a triggering event that gets people involved in the criminal justice system, often at the misdemeanor level. They don't always stay that way. What does this cost us? There are a number of ways to look at or think about cost, and I apologize, many of them are here. Let me just explain. The first one, $1 trillion, is what we have spent on corrections over the past 45, 50 years. Again, this lumps everybody together, the feds, the state, but it's only focusing on the correctional part of criminal justice. We've spent another $1 trillion prosecuting the war on drugs. Another way of looking at it is we annually spend, combined law enforcement, courts, corrections, about $250 billion for the criminal justice system. Or more big picture, I mean, there are costs associated with crime and criminal justice that go way beyond just the criminal justice system, like things like property values are affected by crime. Things that, factors associated with the economy are impacted by crime. So the bigger picture is the real impact of crime and criminal justice is about $1 trillion a year. So what have we accomplished? How has this worked? Well, interestingly, if you look at I don't know if I can do this. So this is a chart of this is incarceration rate going up. And this is the crime rate, and they kind of intersect around 1990. And in 1990 and subsequent to that, we've seen crime rates decline to where we are today, historically low rates. It's a pretty easy sell to say, wow, we did that by expanding incarceration, by expanding correctional control. I cannot count how many elected officials have been elected on that very simple chart that says, our correctional policy, our criminal justice policy, which I gave to you, and therefore you should vote for me, has accomplished all this reduction in crime. True? Not true? It's intuitive, makes sense. Statistically, criminal justice policy has accounted for about 10% of that decline in crime. Nothing is as simple as X causes Y. And just because two things intersect or two trends go in the same direction or different directions, as we all know, correlation is not causality. Our war on drugs has nearly exclusively focused on supply control, trying to limit what is produced in other countries, trying to limit what crosses our borders, trying to limit what is distributed within the country, and trying to limit what is sold on the street corner, and trying to limit what is in your pocket. Has it worked? I mean, you all sort of, well, I think I mentioned the war on drugs earlier. You sounded rather pessimistic. Fair assertion? Yeah. A very simple way to measure this. All else equal, if we were able to control supply significantly, what should happen to the street level price of drugs? Guess what? They've gone down. It's very impressive when, the FBI or the DEA, in fact, they had a big drug bust. Where was it? Someplace where you wouldn't expect it. They had all this cocaine stacked up, and it looked very impressive. But, on the border, they have press conferences with, weapons and money and drugs piled up against the back wall. Cost of doing business for the cartels. We have an insatiable demand for drugs in this country. And one of the fundamental roles of the so-called drug control effort is we do very little to reduce the other variable, demand. Probably the quickest, easiest report card for the effectiveness of the criminal justice system is the extent to which people reoffend. I ain't talking about Minnesota or Duluth here. I'm talking about the country as a whole. I don't even know what your recidivism rates are. But if we look at the system as a whole, after about 8 years, the vast majority of individuals will reoffend. And I would add to that, that's an underestimate, because that's based upon crimes that the police know about for which there's been an arrest. And half of crime is never reported to the police, and arrest rates are highly variable. 60% of homicides end up in arrest, about 18% of burglaries. So really the recidivism rate is probably a good bit higher than 85%, but there ain't a whole hell of a lot higher it can go. So 85% are rearrested, 40% are reincarcerated, and the bad news is that recidivism has increased over time as we have increased our correctional control efforts, as we have toughened the war on crime. And the obvious question is, what is our return on investment? And I think it's tough to paint an optimistic picture of statistics like that. So what did we get wrong? I mean, punishment makes sense. We have, hopefully all of us have experienced punishment. That's how we, or the threat of punishment. That's how we become civil. That's how we become socialized. That's how we learn to follow norms and laws. We're basically taking concepts that make common sense to all of us and saying, let's impose them on this population of offenders. And for some reason, that doesn't seem to work. And that's one of our basic questions. Why doesn't that work, and what can that tell us about what can work? We have been perpetuating a theory of deterrence for the past 50 years, suggesting that the threat of punishment or experiencing crime will deter individuals from reoffending. Well, we can go back to the recidivism statistics. That is obviously not the case. The question is why? And much of that is embedded in the characteristics of criminal offenders. And there it is. 50% have a diagnosable mental illness. 80% have a substance use disorder. 60% have had at least one traumatic brain injury, often resulting in some level of neurocognitive impairment. 15% have an intellectual disability or impairment. And the bad news is these are individual disorders, deficits, impairments, and they tend not to travel alone. They tend to be comorbid. They tend to co-occur. The obvious, most common combination is mental illness and a substance use disorder. We're talking with our county attorney, I don't see where, we were talking about this before dinner, and he was talking about drug courts and the extent to which they were effective or not, and we're talking about how, well, it's often not just that one problem. I mean, the drug court is designed to address one problem, but there may be more problems that the individual is facing, and that is perhaps something we should take into consideration. The news is worse at the juvenile level. The vast majority have a mental health problem there or a neurodevelopmental disorder. We know that age is fundamentally related to the risk of criminal offending. That is, individuals between the ages of, it used to be like 16, I'd take it down to 14 these days, 14 to maybe 22, 24 are high-risk ages for criminal involvement. Why? I can outweigh you. What about the frontal lobe? It's underdeveloped. We know this. This is not, as they say, neuroscience, but it really is. And it's like, wow. So what do we do with that? Well, that's important. It's because, we have for years said Johnny committed that crime because Johnny made a bad decision. Well, hell yes, he made a bad decision. Absolutely. But the next question is why? And maybe he doesn't have the capacity, the developmental capacity at this point in his life to make a good decision. What good does punishing criminal behavior for a kid like that, what does that accomplish? I'm not saying nothing. There's room for retribution. There's room for punishment. There's also room for balance. I was talking with some folks in a class this morning on employment and justice. Employment is a very significant criminogenic circumstance. Criminogenic meaning crime-producing. Education, what did I say? Employment. I knew I was wrong. Why did you let me say that, Tom? You promised you wouldn't let me embarrass myself. Let me skip to education since I'm talking about that. We'll come back to employment in a moment. Poor education is a criminogenic circumstance. It is a characteristic, a very common characteristic of individuals who end up in the criminal justice system. So is unemployment or employment disruption, employment problems. Housing, as I mentioned earlier, absolutely. Probably the most important common denominator is poverty and everything associated with it. Many of these other things are associated with it. But you know, if there is a defining characteristic of the offender population, it is disadvantage, it is lack of opportunity, it is lack of alternatives. And it's really simple, that there's really not much about punishment that addresses any of these criminogenic circumstances. What is it about being in prison that makes somebody psychotic, unpsychotic? I suppose there's some assumption that, you know, while you're in prison and not doing drugs, then your drug problem's taken care of. Abstinence ain't treatment. Same thing with, you know, the effects of a traumatic brain injury. Or, you know, is being in prison going to help your employability when you get out? In Texas, we have 300 occupations for which individuals are not allowed to be licensed or certified. The great irony, they will train you into Texas prison system to be a barber, but you can't be licensed to be a barber when you get out. Figure that one out. So what the hell are we supposed to do? Where do we go from here? What are the answers? Well, I don't think we should dismantle the prisons. I'm not one of those liberals that says, you know, I think we should start over. We should get everybody in a big group and talk to them and try and convince them not to engage in bad behavior. Get rid of prisons. I don't know, open camps or something and take it from there. No, we need prisons. We need prisons for a variety of reasons. There are people that need to be separated from society, people that are particularly dangerous, people that are repeat offenders who seem to not get the message that what they're doing is not something that's acceptable. The question that Tom asked this morning in class, is there a place for retribution in all this? You know, an eye for an eye, vengeance. The answer is hell yes. I mean, I can imagine any number of circumstances. If somebody lays a hand on my golden retriever, I'll kill him. That might be a bit of exaggeration. But I can certainly envision situations where somebody does something to me or somebody I know, and yeah, I just want an eye for an eye. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, who am I to say that? I don't think there's anything wrong with that, except that it doesn't really accomplish any big picture goals other than satisfying the emotional needs of the community or the victim or whatever, and that's perfectly fine. But that should not be our go-to response when somebody commits a crime. We should not be making decisions based upon anger. We should be making decisions based upon what is in the best interest of all involved. So yes, we need to use prisons, but we need to use them in a smarter way. I would suggest that we need to start developing ways to make better decisions about who needs to do what. This has nothing to do with Judge Harris. It has to do everything, all the judges in Texas that I know, federal judge, state judge, that I talk to about this. I said, what do you do, when do you think about at a sentencing hearing, you know, when it's time to determine how much punishment somebody should get? And they go typically, well, how much harm was involved in the commission of the crime? How much harm did they, you know, engage in the past? Are there any other factors that I need to consider here? Maybe yes, maybe no. The question that rarely comes up is really, what do we need to do to reduce the likelihood this person is going to come back? Because at the end of the day, if the criminal justice system is here for anything, I would assume it's to cut down on repeat business. I mean, we throw what we have at people on the assumption that that's going to reduce the likelihood of them reoffending, which in turn will impact the crime rate. I interviewed, I had some folks interview prosecutors and judges and public defenders last year for a book that I was working on, actually the one with Pittman that you were talking about. And we asked them, what is your role in terms of reducing recidivism? And they all gave the same answer. What are you talking about? It's not my job. Seriously. The public defenders were more pointed, you know, like, well, it really isn't my job, but no one else is doing it either. But prosecutors, I mean, not DAs, but prosecutors were sort of, I don't know. And judges were the same way. They feel like it's somebody else's responsibility. So if you're angry about recidivism, the obvious question, who are you going to call? I mean, this is not a plug for Ghostbusters. But seriously, I mean, who's responsible for it? And the answer is really nobody. The state legislature won't take credit because they'll say, well, it's the criminal justice people. And then if it's, you know, this person, they'll say, well, that's not in my job description. So, you know, the one thing that the criminal justice system really should be focused on is not a common question that is often asked. So I would suggest, perhaps going forward, our focus should be on reducing recidivism and the use of the evidence base that we have available today that tells us how to effectively change behavior, because that's what the criminal justice system should be all about. Yes, it should be for putting some people away for the sake of punishment. For everybody else, it should be changing behavior. There are so many things that need fixing in the American criminal justice system. And am I doing fine on time, Tom? Oh, yeah. Said 2 more hours? Good. There's a long list on the list of things that need to be fixed. And I'm not going to focus on all those things tonight, but I think there's some that really require a moment of attention. Probation was designed as an opportunity to avoid the criminogenic impact of being incarcerated, to allow people to remain in the community and receive services, programming, whether it's, you know, remedial education or employment training or mental health treatment or whatever. That was the idea, that concept behind probation. In many jurisdictions today, and even there's variation within probation departments, much of the focus is on risk management, that is supervision, and much less focus today on trying to intervene, address criminogenic circumstances. So we have and there are many more people on probation than there are incarcerated. So the vast majority of people under correctional control are in a system that is not really addressing recidivism. It's basically monitoring and trying to control what they're doing while they're under supervision. We need to seriously address that and begin either reinventing probation or develop some other concept. Bail reform is something probably some of you have been hearing about in the media lately. It is the perceived excessive use of jail for people who are being detained pretrial meaning awaiting disposition of their case. There are examples of judges who have been rather conservative in their decisions about who to detain and who not to detain. And the concern is that there's an overuse of incarceration. And it's not just that that's an inconvenience, but being in jail can have profound consequences for things like your job, your housing, your family status. I mean, it shouldn't be a casual decision because, in fact, the research shows if you're in jail overnight, not much of an impact. If you're in jail 2 or more days, it can have a profound impact on longer-term recidivism. So, you know, it's really in the interest of public safety whether we, you know, detain somebody pre-trial, but we need to sort of rebalance that. And many jurisdictions are beginning to address this through the use of things like risk assessments, which is a step in the right direction. It's a much bigger issue. We're not going to get to it today. We need to radically rethink what it's like in prison. We spoke this morning about, I think, Tom, you brought this up as well. How they go about doing this in Norway or Germany or many other Western or Northern European countries. And it's a remarkable contrast to how we operate American prisons. In this country, for the most part, the goal is to deprive inmates of liberty and to make their lives relatively miserable. In Norway, when an inmate arrives at the prison system, from the first moment they arrive, the effort is to prepare them to leave, to return to the community, to be productive citizens. It's a cultural shift. It's a different way of thinking about crime and punishment. It's a different way of thinking about how we can address issues of public safety in a more constructive way. You know, it's so interesting. I love this scenario. There was a warden from some prison in the US who went with a group of folks over to Norway and Germany and sort of looked how they were doing things. And I remember that this one warden saying, you know, it's just amazing, if you treat people like humans, they'll act like it. You know, I don't know if that took or not, but it's a remarkable conclusion. We have ignored the whole issue of reentry for the most part for the past 50 years. We lock people up. What we fail to appreciate is 98% of them will get out at some point. Some of them will be too old to re-engage in crime. Some of them maybe not so much. But we basically, you know, have assumed, well, you've learned your lesson. You're off now and don't do this again. And everyone says when they're walking out the door, I'll never come back. And as you already know, the vast majority of them come back. And that's because we don't do anything to facilitate, sorry, that's an exaggeration. We don't do as much as we should to facilitate successful reentry. Ban the box, step in the right direction. Sort of programming for people on probation, like education or linking them up to community services, not a bad idea, but not nearly as extensive as it needs to be. You can't just assume after you lock somebody up for 5, 10 years that when they get out, they're going to figure their way around. Criminal justice reform is not just a matter of changing the criminal justice system. If all we do is tinker with law and procedure, we're not going to get where we need to be. As I was mentioning earlier, there are a variety of other institutions that are culpable in the mess that we find ourselves in. We need to rethink public education. I mean, I don't think we had this when I was in school, but what did they call them? It's school resource officer. The kinder, gentler term for cop in the school. And often, more often than it should be, the first response to a kid who's acting up, I mean, good Lord, I'd be in prison today if I got nabbed for every time I acted up in school, is to call the cop, and that then begins a process. And the research indicates brushing up against the juvenile justice system has a dramatic impact on increasing recidivism. Probably the worst thing we could do is to get law enforcement involved, unless it's obviously a serious situation. But you know, schools don't seem to want to have to deal with problems anymore. Anyhow, much improvement needed there. Public health is huge. We have made conscious decisions, rightly or wrongly, that we're satisfied, I guess, to let the criminal justice system be the asylum, to let the criminal justice system be the drug treatment facility. And then our lack of affordable housing puts many individuals at risk, if for no other reason, their behavior is more visible on the street because they don't have housing, and you know, they do something that gets the law enforcement's attention, and that begins the process. So the bigger picture here is not just criminal justice reform. That's a component, a very important component, but that alone is probably not going to be able to do the whole thing. In my mind, what we're talking about here ain't at the state level. I don't think where we need to go can be effectively legislated, either by state legislatures or Congress. I firmly believe that true criminal justice reform, meaningful criminal justice reform, really has to occur at the local level. It has to be compatible with local concerns and needs and resources. It requires local leadership. As I mentioned earlier, every county is, this is where district attorneys or county attorneys are. This is where judges are. This is where jails are. This is where law enforcement is. And they all operate together. And presumably at some level, because most DAs and judges are elected, they reflect the sentiments of the community. That really is the starting place. State legislatures can play an important role in terms of providing funding, providing institutional support, but they should not meddle. They should meddle carefully in local matters. I think probably a good example of what I'm talking about is we have in the past 4 or 5 years seen the election of so-called progressive prosecutors around this country. I think we interviewed one in Minnesota. I can't remember where it was, but we've interviewed about 30 so far. There are some very high-profile progressive prosecutors like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, John Creuzot in Dallas County. But they're being elected in large metropolitan areas by large minority populations that are saying it's time to do business in a different way. And I think this is a pretty remarkable trend. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, to sort of follow what they're doing. For example, in some jurisdictions, they're declining to prosecute low-level misdemeanor, low-level marijuana misdemeanor cases, theft, low-level theft cases, things like that, implementing intervention and diversion programs, more so than we already have. But it's sort of interesting to also, well, let me just do a little sidebar. Well, that's no pun intended, but the Attorney General Bill Barr, or Beer Barr, can be a very irritating human being. And in particular, about a month ago, he was giving a speech before the Fraternal Order of Police, and he was making the point that these so-called progressive prosecutors are going to take us back to the 1980s and 1990s of high crime. And he was basically saying this is precisely the wrong idea, the wrong direction. There is absolutely no basis for that other than political. So another sort of tough on crime approach from the you-know-what administration. The focus, again, while there are many things that need repair, if we have to focus our energy, which we don't have to, but let's just pretend we do, it seems to me that that we can leverage most of what we need to do if we focus on what is called the pretrial phase. Everything from the point of the arrest through sentencing. And particularly based on the decisions made by key individuals, prosecutors, judges, and public defenders. The vast majority of criminal defendants in this country are indigent, 80%, cannot retain their own counsel, so they have to rely on public defenders or assigned counsel. So those three sets of individuals make very important decisions that impact everything else. In particular, I would suggest, and there may be some disagreement, that the most important decision makers in the criminal justice system are prosecutors. And one of the reasons for that is sentencing reform. That is, mandatory sentences and guideline sentences have taken away judicial discretion. That discretion doesn't evaporate, it simply moves upstream to the prosecutor because the charging decisions, what is agreed upon in a plea deal, now largely dictate the sentence. So prosecutors are the most important in terms of the variety of decisions they make, what cases to prosecute, what evidence to use, what to indict somebody for, what to offer in a plea deal, and importantly, sentencing recommendation. I would suggest that the decision-making by prosecutors and judges need to focus more on individuals and individual cases than on categories. We should not be focusing on sex offenders. We should be focusing on this particular sex offender. We should not be thinking about violent offenders as a class of individuals. We should be thinking about specific cases and specific people. I think it's also important that we look at the big picture of offenders and identify as many so-called criminogenic circumstances or characteristics as possible in order to get a good handle on what we need to do to effectively reduce recidivism. We have a wealth of information on what works and what doesn't in terms of intervention. And it is time to start relying more heavily on that. Balance is the key. Again, I mean, I'm not saying we give everybody get out of jail free. This is your lucky day, second chance, third chance. We need to balance risk of reoffending, public safety considerations on the one hand, with rehabilitation, intervention, treatment, behavioral change, whatever you want to call it. And whenever possible in our decision making, we should consider the criminogenic impact, that is the crime-producing, recidivism-producing impact that is associated with things like incarceration. What we recommended in one of the books and sort of test drove in a subsequent book was a very simple concept. Criminal offenders arrive at the criminal justice system often with very complex situations. Trauma is common, and not just physical trauma, but emotional trauma, mental illness. I mean, the litany of things, mental illness, substance abuse, the list goes on and on and on. Prosecutors are lawyers. Judges are lawyers. Public defenders are lawyers. They understand the law. They understand criminal procedure. They don't understand psychiatry, and they shouldn't. That's why it makes at least intuitive sense to provide expert analysis, screening, assessment, expert opinions to key decision makers about what are the factors in a particular case that need to be addressed in order to effectively reduce recidivism. So these individuals will be responsible for, as early as possible in the pretrial phase, maybe even to intake when somebody is arrested, earlier the better, because all those decisions, like the pretrial detaining decision versus release, can have profound downstream consequences. These panels would be, it would be created to advise, not to dictate, but to advise, provide, whoops, sorry, that was my own timer. Am I still okay? 10 minutes? Okay. They need to appreciate the complexity that criminal offenders often have. They need to assess risk of reoffending and therefore be able to balance the public safety concern with the behavioral change concern. And rather than the reflexive, how much punishment does somebody get, it would be, I would encourage decision makers to use the information provided by these expert panels to determine what might be an appropriate intervention strategy. We tested the concept in these interviews with prosecutors and judges and defense counsel, and they said absolutely. Now, saying it and doing it are two different things, but, you know, common response, I didn't go to medical school, I don't know what all these things are. Public defenders were telling us, and the prosecutors agreed, it's up to the public defender to raise the issue that a client is mentally ill. What does a public defender know, except maybe somebody obvious who is psychotic? I mean, I could make that determination, but often mental illness is more subtle than that, and just because somebody's not in a full-blown psychosis doesn't mean we shouldn't consider their circumstances. Yeah, we need all the help we can get. You know, I keep seeing the same people coming back and coming back. We need to think of a different way of doing it. So what's needed? Well, we have, and you all have several right here in Duluth and in Minnesota, and every other state has diversion courts like drug courts and mental health courts and veterans courts and reentry courts, and you name the problem and there's a court for it. The problem is they don't come close to meeting capacity, or the capacity doesn't come close to meeting demand. Recently estimated that all the drug courts, we have 3,100 drug courts in this country, and those 3,100 drug courts can account for about 10% of the actual need. That is, they can admit about 10% of the people who could qualify and benefit from participation. Funding, obviously, is a huge issue. We're not talking about something that is inexpensive. We're talking about developing interventions for behavioral change on a scale that we have not seen before. But interestingly, there's the belief that treatment is more expensive than incarceration. And all the cost-benefit studies that I've seen indicate that is not true in the moment. That is, it is less expensive to treat than to incarcerate today an individual. And it's much less expensive longer term. If you treat me today and I don't reoffend, every time I don't come back into the criminal justice system, you don't have to spend all that money on me again. The cops don't have to spend money arresting me. The jail doesn't have to spend money detaining me. The prosecutor doesn't have to spend money with my case. The judge doesn't have to spend money with my case. Policymakers often don't look longer term in terms of cost and benefit. Obviously, everybody needs to embrace the goal of reducing recidivism, and that fundamentally means a change in how we think about crime and punishment. Much of the challenge here ain't funding. It ain't changing the law. It's not developing panels of experts. It's really changing how we think about crime and punishment. We still have, at the base of all of this, is a sense of retribution. That's really what the criminal justice system is for. But it, once again, has phenomenally limited utility. And we have to change how we think about this. We have to consider that the individuals who engage in crime do so for a variety of reasons. Not everyone who does it is evil or bad. If you look at their circumstances, you think, well, what would I be doing if I was in that circumstance? I'd be doing precisely the same thing. If I grew up in poverty and had a variety of psychological, psychiatric, cognitive, whatever impairments, hell yes, I'd be committing crime because I probably would not be able to do anything else. What's going to get in the way? Way too many things. It is still sellable to be tough on crime. Even with what we know today, tough on crime, it still resonates with the public. And the real irony here is public opinion polls indicate the public understands or believes that the criminal justice system should be here to rehabilitate people, not to punish. So on the one hand, the public says, here's what we want the system to do. At the same time, they keep re-electing tough on crime elected officials. Hard to figure. I am so tired, bless his heart, Cory Booker, running for president as a Democrat, keeps talking about the First Step Act. Damn it. As if that is the end all and be all of criminal justice reform. The First Step Act is a really tiny step in a good direction. I think they've released about 4,000 federal inmates early on primarily drug charges. So that's a good thing. But you know, Cory, the job ain't done yet. So when people label piecemeal reform as this is it, this is what I've accomplished, this is true criminal justice reform, I just sort of want to, I don't know, take them aside and can we think bigger picture here? Because really, the task at hand is so fundamentally a 180 for the American criminal justice system. Why do it? Well, the thing I would tell prosecutors and judges, you know those caseloads that you keep complaining about? At least in Travis County, where I come from, the federal courts every year, the felony courts every year have about 25,000 cases carry over to the next year. And over the past 15 years, they've really not made up any of that. So there's a huge caseload pressure problem. Misdemeanor courts even worse, about 90,000 cases carry over from year to year. Why? Are we having huge crime problems in Austin? No, it's recidivism. 3/4 of the people that show up in those courtrooms and on those prosecutors' caseloads have been there before. Our failure to reduce recidivism creates the pressure on the criminal justice system that requires things like 95% plea negotiation rates and a variety of other ways to expedite caseloads and dockets. There are also consequences. When somebody reoffends, there are victims. And for some reason, I mean, I understand why, but the status quo is one that impacts many individuals much more than just the individual who committed the crime. It affects communities, it affects victims, it affects our sense of well-being. It will also, I mean, again, all the research indicates that fundamentally shifting how we go about the business of this can save tremendous amounts of money. It is much more cost efficient to change behavior than to keep incarcerating individuals time and time and time again. And that is all I know.
Good job, but you're not done yet, I don't think. Do we have questions? People come down here and use the microphone. I think somebody's come. Here comes one. Okay.
Oh, this question's for you, Tom. You're not going anywhere.
Hi, I'm one of Dr. Morgan's students who read your book. You mentioned the concept of charge stacking, and I was wondering if you could go a little in depth of how you can prevent charge stacking, especially in relation to the idea that different levels of the criminal justice system should be collaborating on a punishment.
Charge stacking is a tactic that's used by prosecutors. Often, I mean, it involves, it's also called overcharging. That is trying to bring, multiple charges to a situation, with the goal being often to have something to negotiate down in a plea deal. Part of the problem in the most recent book, well, actually not the one that's before the one that you all are reading, Confronting Underground Justice. It's called Underground Justice because it's about plea negotiation and the fact that that largely occurs behind closed doors and puts a lot of power and authority in the hands of prosecutors, of line prosecutors. And what we were trying to do there was to address issues of due process, issues of perhaps coercion that might enter into the plea negotiation process. The problem is we don't know how often those things happen because you can't observe these things. So it's really a matter of trying to ensure due process concerns. But then you raise the issue of collaboration, which is a little bit of a different concept. But I mean, the idea is, ideally, that a prosecutor and defendant or defense counsel would get together and there would be a discussion about what's it going to take to stop this pattern. What's it going to take from these, time and time again, reending the criminal justice system. That's what that collaboration really should look like. That is a sea change in terms of how business is currently being conducted. And again, gets to the idea of we need to fundamentally change not just the process, but how we think about crime and punishment.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes. We're going back and forth like this tennis? Okay.
I'm one of Dr. Morgan's Peace and Justice students as well, and I would like to know what you think is our role as a community is for addressing these issues.
Really good question, and the answer is community. It really gets to the heart of the idea that criminal justice reform is really a local matter. So what you all care about, what you want your criminal justice system to do, should be, sort of the focus of what you talk about. How you make that public through elections or through, referenda or through formats like this. But honestly, at the end of the day, real innovation is a grassroots, bottom-up kind of process. So I would say, figure out what you think the issues are locally, and identify strategies to mitigate those problems, and communicate that to the key decision makers. Sure.
Hi, I'm Callie from the class you talked to earlier.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm not going to mention. Yeah. Okay.
That would be good.
Yeah.
So,
if never mind.
So being that you're from Texas, you probably have some familiar with this idea, but like in a reformed prison system, where would capital punishment lie? Would it even exist? Would it be edited? What would happen?
So should we still have it? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, or like should there be a revision? I don't even know.
Yeah, here's the thing. Personally, I can see a situation where again, it gets back to retribution. I can see a situation where somebody does something to a loved one, and you know what? Just, damn it, I want them to die for it. But that ain't policy. All the research is quite clear that the death penalty does not deter. Well, it does deter the individual who's been executed, but beyond that, it doesn't have what is called a general deterrent effect. So I'm tired of people saying, well, we're going to solve this problem by sending a message, you do this crime here, you're going to die for it. This whole idea of general deterrence, the people that need to hear that message ain't hearing it, and the people that do hear it don't need to hear it. So I'm of two minds, but I have real problems with how the death penalty is implemented. Good Lord, there are stories. There was one, I think it was an assigned counsel in Harris County, which is Houston in Texas. He handled mainly death penalty cases. And he was notoriously known for being intoxicated during trials, for being asleep during trials. And, you know, damn it, that was still considered adequate counsel by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. I have problems with that. That's an extreme version of it. If you look at the race ethnic differences in terms of who gets the death penalty and who doesn't, I have real concerns about that.
Hi. So in your book and tonight you talked about using punishment as a deterrent, as you brought up. And I guess I'm wondering about how I kind of have a difficult time with the statement you made about that we should completely throw out deterrence, because I can think of like personal cases, I guess, for example, like parking tickets or speeding tickets, where I have been deterred by that, you know,
I have as well. Often not, because I've gotten many tickets. No, I don't say get rid of it. I say don't rely on it, because the evidence does not support it. At the individual level, yes, of course. I mean, that probably affects any number of people in this room. But in the aggregate, as a policy, we should not rely upon it as a reason or a motivation for implementing punishment.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
You had mentioned that treatment and therefore prevention would be cheaper than incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
So would a system where things like therapy and rehabilitation, if those two things were like more affordable for the general public under an idea like universal health care or something like that, would implementing those things help reduce criminality?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If we didn't have such a mental health problem in this country, not because if we didn't have a lack of proper mental health treatment, access for individuals to public mental health treatment, we wouldn't have 50% of the prison population having a mental health problem. That's a result of the lack of capacity for adequate treatment. Absolutely. The criminal justice system is the repository for these failures. And that's why, again, the bigger picture of reform is not just picking on the criminal justice system, because there are many other culprits involved in getting the criminal justice system to where it is today. And, you know, it's unfortunate that prosecutors and judges and, you know, defense lawyers have to deal with cases like that are, you know, difficult to deal with, for which there are not easy answers and few resources, you know, to bring to bear on the matter. But those are decisions we've made as a society, as a country. You know, Texas, I can pick on Texas. We have refused to extend Medicaid. And the Texas legislature is adamantly against the Affordable Care Act. One of the most important things the ACA did was to require parity for mental health treatment and physical health treatment. Absent that, we would have even less capacity than we currently do. I mean, it's political, but it has profound consequences for something like the criminal justice system, where you wouldn't even think, what's the connection? Well, it's an obvious connection. I have no idea if I even came close to answering your question.
Yeah, you did. Thank
Hi.
you.
Hey, my name's Jamie. I'm a Duluth resident. A lot of the themes in your talk kind of reminded me of the movie The Joker that just came out, that I just recently saw. I don't know if you saw it yet.
Is he calling me a joker?
No. For people who haven't seen it, it really kind of takes this villain of the Batman series that was really kind of the epitome of true evil and crime, and kind of twists it upside down, and you see this guy who really is just this horrible kind of production of these terrible circumstances that were created by the society that he grew up in. I thought it was a pretty phenomenal film, but with that and the radical message too, still like all of the newspaper reviews of the movie were that it was boring or not super interesting or it wasn't a superhero movie. So I guess my question for you is, how do we as a society kind of start to associate, you know, what we once saw as a superhero as this kind of problematic, tough on crime idea? And, you know, do we like tough on crime because it's like the superhero. Like, how do we start to disassociate this thing that we have for so long held as really good?
Yeah, good question and great analogy. I would say it failed us. The superhero ain't the superhero. The superhero is the I'm going with the Wizard of Oz here, help me out. The guy behind the curtain. This ain't working, is it? Just let me swing here in the wind. Thanks a lot, people. Huh? Yeah, that one. It's like the Wizard of Oz, like I was saying, right? I really make two arguments with tough on crime. One, it's ineffective, and two, it's a horrible waste of money. Now, you can pick. If you're a liberal, you're going to say, I'll take the ineffective one. If you're conservative, some of my work is supported by the Charles Koch Foundation. In case you haven't guessed, I'm a liberal Democrat. Charles Koch ain't. But they're interested in criminal justice reform. So in those audiences, I talk about how excruciatingly wasteful of public money this is. So, I mean, there's appeal for both sides. But at the end of the day, the conclusion is the same. Tough on crime is a failure. Hi.
Hi.
Here.
So I was just curious about how you would handle the race issue because so many people are wrongfully convicted or incarcerated because of the color of their skin, and part of that could be coming from fear of society, but even law enforcement officers, they're also just shooting people because it's coming from a source of fear. But then, even when they're shooting people for no reason, they're just kind of let off the hook, and shouldn't we be treating them the same as criminals?
I have not said anything about law enforcement. I mean, that's not to say it's not important. It's fundamentally important. Police deploy resources where they think crime is, and that tends to be poor neighborhoods, which tend to be minority neighborhoods, which then, increases the likelihood that minority individuals engaging in crime are caught up in the criminal justice system. And white folks, less poor folks, in other neighborhoods engaging in the same activity may not be as likely to enter the criminal justice system. We have a long history of race bias in the American criminal justice system. I would suggest things are better, but they're not anywhere where they need to be. There are a variety of problems associated with the use of force by law enforcement against minorities. We've had many high-profile cases in the past 10 years. I don't have an easy solution for that. I tend not to focus too much at all on law enforcement, although I will say there decisions about arresting people versus, for example, cite and release, which is a ticket, can have an important impact on people being detained in jail, which can then perpetuate negative outcomes. The whole race thing, though, you mentioned wrongful conviction. Yeah, and the fact that the majority of people in prison or jail are minorities. Part of that's a race issue, part of that is a poverty issue, part of that is a lack of alternatives and access to opportunity. It's something that the American criminal justice system needs to confront front and center and talk about honestly and openly. I think at the end of the day, the solution is going to have to be embedded in things like in enhancing socioeconomic status across the board. Other than that, I mean, it's probably the most difficult issue to address in American criminal justice because it gets to the heart of whether or not this system is even legitimate. I mean, how can you support a system that clearly violates, our sense of what is moral, what is right, in terms of, at least the appearance of the outcomes of who's arrested, who's convicted, who's punished? What do you think?
I think that we could do a better job of increasing diversity throughout, I guess, really wherever. I'm from Minneapolis, so I've seen a lot of this, and even in my hometown. I'm from just north of Minneapolis, and we had an officer shoot a man in our streets, and he was just kind of let off the hook. But I mean, it still is around us all the time, and I think it's kind of gross that we just let it happen, and that, I mean, we're just kind of accepting that
Yeah, and actually, I mean, another thing that just hit me, I mean, a lot of the progressive prosecutors that have been elected in recent years are minority. And I think that's an important step in enhancing, concerns about fairness and equity, at least at the local level. And again, that gets back to the concept that fundamental change is local, should be, in part reflecting demographics of local communities. Thank you.
Okay, this will be the last question.
All right.
I was struck by the 50% of people know someone who's been involved. And I was thinking that if you're a victim, you get into that tough on crime, people need to pay. But if we're going to change, and 50% of people would like a plea agreement if my son, my brother, my father. So I was thinking one of the ways to start flipping this is looking at that 50% and starting to think about how do you want your family member to go through the criminal justice system.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that would put a focus on sort of the broader consequences of the decisions that are made. Whether to incarcerate somebody or put them on probation or some type of a diversion program. Yeah, because incarceration doesn't just impact the person who's incarcerated. I mean, it ravages families. It even, I mean, hell, there were, 10 years ago, it was not uncommon to read in a headline of a large metropolitan area, 50% of young black men are not in the community anymore because they're in the criminal justice system. So there are consequences at the community level, at the neighborhood level, at the family level, and those voices probably should be part of the dialogue. Good point. Thank you.
Thank you again, Professor Kelly. Thank you all very much for coming. We'll have a little reception in the back. I'm quite sure we will. And you can continue this with Professor Kelly, and I'm sure he'll chat with you for a while. I've got your whole week now planned for you. Wednesday, we go to First Lutheran Church, and we talk about this evening under the direction of Judge Harris, who's going to facilitate the conversation. And then Thursday, we come back here and go to the concert. Friday, you're free. Thank you all very much for coming.